and we're back with Philip Smith, founder and president of the National African American Gun Association. And so I got to ask, right now there's a bit of an issue. There's an image issue when it comes to black gun ownership in this country. And every culture, generally speaking, has their own image when it comes to firearm ownership. That's very relatively unique to that culture. And with the black image, it's largely based around the idea of gangs, drug dealing, not very positive imagery. How do you think we can go about, what's the best, most effective means by which to kind of combat that imagery? Because I think in large part, it's that imagery that's causing the biggest issue in our community.
I think just being diligent, doing what you're doing what my group is doing, making sure that the imagery slowly begins to change. Yeah. And that's by having lots and lots of black folks be seen with guns. Lots and lots of black folks going to the gun range, and where hopefully in 20 years from now, when someone sees an African-American young male walking down the street with a gun on at his hip, they'll say, hey, he probably belongs to NAAGA. That's the end goal. And to change social narrative is a very, very long process because you have to change the way people think. And you touched upon something that's very, very powerful, and that's images. Images can often dictate how someone is viewed, if they live or die, based on some reactions of law enforcement. So you're definitely talk about something that's very, very important, imagery. No,
absolutely. And so with that being said, when I think about the images that are pushed out there, I can't help. Like I said, I'm not very much in the way of conspiracy theories. I'm not that guy. However, I can't help but feel there's an undertone of a very purposeful image being pushed out there to force a kind of anti-gun mentality into the community, from the standpoint that where you're just, because there's a complete vacuum of positive representation of black firearm ownership in the mainstream media, and I never quite understood why that is the case when I can get positive imagery from every other group.
Right.
But for whatever reason, I'm not really getting it when it comes to black firearm ownership.
Right. You touched on something that is very, very, it's tough. Some of my most difficult conversations have been within my own community. Mm-hmm. And I love being black. I love my people. I love my black women and men and young kids. But some of the toughest discussions I've had are with some individuals in the community who feel, for whatever reason, we should never have guns. And that's just been passed down from generation to generation. I don't want to lean on the excuse of slavery, but maybe that DNA in some way, shape, or form has been ingrained or etched in that particular person's mindset. And a lot of folks like that are running around. My job as a leader of the National African American Gun Association is to change that thinking.
Yeah.
That it's okay to protect yourself. Yeah. If you want to have a gun at your nightstand at 2 a.m. and somebody breaks in, it's okay to shoot them. Yeah. I'm not trying to be rude or anything, but it's protect ourselves. We should not give up the Second Amendment. Our relatives died. Our ancestors died for us. They laid blood on this country. Why can't we take advantage of the Second Amendment right, which is given to us? So you're absolutely correct.
I think there's this false, from a historical context, there's this false narrative that I think that's been pushed, especially when we start talking about civil rights and start talking about the likes of Martin Luther King and the whole kind of passive resistance. And I think there's been a false narrative that's been pushed out there that tells us you're supposed to be passive to the point of your own detriment.
If you read my website, we try to lay out the history of guns in our community. And we did not just lay down and let someone kill us. We had the Deacons of Defense, which were a very proactive and defensive-minded organization. Martin Luther King applied for a gun himself. So that narrative, for whatever reason, that we just supposed to sit there and let somebody just slap us and beat us around, that has to be eliminated. It has to be eliminated, I think, pretty quickly.
No, absolutely. And it was one of the more frustrating components. I did a video about Martin Luther King, and I remember there was an analyst, I forgot his name, he was kind of more of a left-leaning analyst, and he was enraged at the fact that I even aligned the idea of self-protection with Martin Luther King. He even went so far as to call me a punk. And so, and it was interesting to me. I was like, wow, like you're legitimately, vehemently angry at the fact that I even brought up the notion of me being able to protect myself with a firearm, and then attributing a lot of that to Martin Luther King, because as you point out, like he did apply for a concealed carry permit, yet he was denied.
Right.
When we start looking at all of the genesis for all of the gun control laws, the very genesis of them was based on the idea of keeping guns out of the hands of people who look like you and I.
Right.
And so how that rhetoric has survived up until this point. Now, granted, it's changed a little bit. It's shifted in some way, in some forms, but nonetheless still survived from the standpoint of, okay, you all over here shouldn't have guns. It's the repetitive, well, black people are more likely to be killed by other black men, so therefore you shouldn't own firearms. They don't do that with any other group. There's no other group that they use that narrative to try to convince that particular group not to own a firearm. And I'm like, why is this continuing to be the case with us? And it's incredibly frustrating.
Yeah, and it kind of speaks to the maturation process of what's going through our community right now. People are slowly starting to open their eyes up. It's a hard and long process, but I think eventually that old narrative, hey, you're not supposed to have a gun, is going to be washed away by the realities of today's society. Because people are saying, you know what, I have the right to protect myself.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I noted was, I think people undervalue how much the gun can help another person want to improve their life. And I know it seems odd. It doesn't seem like it makes much sense, or there's not much in a way of connection there. But I know for me, what it did for me, one, it forced me to step out of my comfort zone. It forced me to put myself into places I probably would never put myself before. And as a result of that, I'm a better person in that regard. Me wanting to become a better shooter, learning how to shoot more proficiently. All of these things, it actually forced me to appreciate nature, being outdoors. I was a concrete jungle baby. I was, I'll just give me my concrete. I don't ever want to leave the city. I learned to appreciate being outdoors and appreciating nature in a way that I probably never would have before. But even more importantly, what it did was it forced me to interact with people I probably would have never interacted with before as well.
Right.
And,
right. One of the things that I take great pride and get a lot of joy from is when you have someone who comes in the door and says, hey, Phil, I want to own a gun. I've never shot a gun. And we take that person from literally baby steps where we introduce them to the gun range officer. We take them to the counter for the first time, and they're looking at the Glock, which is an Ace K versus a Smith & Wesson. They're saying, which one's best for me? And they hold that gun for the first time. And then they say, I like this particular gun. And watching them go to the gun range for the first time after they had their lessons to shoot. And to see that person 6 months later when they've got their little HK bag or, hey, how you doing there? Walking past you like they've been doing this for 5 or 6 years.
Yeah.
That's a great process. And to see African Americans in great numbers doing that, it just brings joy to my heart, I tell you.
I'm a little jealous because, I don't get to go back and relive, because there's almost kind of like there's two births when you start getting into firearms. There's the very first time you shot, and then the very first time you shoot a gun that you own.
Right.
And it's like, I remember both of those times being incredible, and you just have such great pride in that object because you understand what it represents. There's an inherent independence and self-sufficiency involved with firearm ownership, along with responsibility that you are proud of. And I think it's hard for a lot of people to conceptualize that until they've actually gone out and shot and owned a gun for themselves in many ways.
When you go through that process from, like you just mentioned, from beginning to end, and it's like you've birthed a baby.
Yeah.
You're like, wow, I've done it. I get that once in a lifetime feeling. It really kind of lets you know that, this is a process where I'm growing. I'm going outside of my element.
Yep.
And that's something that everyone should, try to do at some point in time in their life.
Yeah. I actually forgot one too. When you first walk out of your house carrying a firearm with your concealed carry license for the first time too. That's another one. There's so many of these gradual steps that's in place that I've completely overlooked as time has gone on because it's been a while. But I mean, and so I think I'm more envious of you because you get to see it. You get to see it over and over again.
Especially being in Atlanta, we're kind of like in the Southeast is somewhat like a black belt, and in that belt, Atlanta is the buckle. Yeah, we have a huge number of African Americans here. So typically, I'll give you an example. This Saturday, we're having our monthly meetup. We have 60 African Americans coming to one meeting.
Wow.
AR-15s, AK-47s, Glocks, Smith & Wesson, whatever your gun you might have, and they're all going to come have a meeting. So I do see it, and I know I'm spoiled in some regard, but I love seeing get educated the right way, go have a good time at the range. We have a great range that we go to, and just seeing that process, it's a beautiful thing.
Absolutely. We're going to take one quick break, and when we come back, I want to kind of talk about some of the guns that you see most people gravitating towards, and then also I ended off like kind of getting on my soapbox about a mutual friend of ours, so to speak.
Oh. All right.